Hello, comrades and friends. Welcome to our book talk for Viviremos, Venezuela versus Hybrid War on the International Day of Solidarity with Venezuela. My name is Mia, and I'm with the People's Forum, a political and popular education space based in New York City for international working class movement building. Today, we will be hearing from the contributors to the book, Carlos Ron, Claudia De la Cruz, Manolo De Los Santos, and Vijay Prashad. We're very excited to be talking about this concept of hybrid war, cutting through the very deliberately opaque narrative of US sanctions and sharing the ongoing struggles of resistance in Venezuela. For those on Zoom, you can submit any questions you have using the Q&A function, and for those on YouTube and social media, you can use the chat to submit questions. And with that, I believe we are starting with a music video.
Padre, hacia aquellos montes lejos. Miren el rastro en la paja. Míreselo, compañero. Como las claras garúas en el terronal reseco. Como en las mesas el pozo. Como en el caño el lucero. Como la garza en el junco. Como en la tarde los vuelos, como la nieve en el pico, como en la noche el incendio, como el cocuyo en el aire, como la luna en el médano, como el potro en el escudo y el tricolor en el cielo.
Es el barrio.
Nuestra voz no callará.
No.
Somos ese bravo pueblo por el cual Bolívar dio su vida por la libertad.
Por la libertad.
Y hace rato que nos afamó de las cadenas y le juramos que no volverá.
No.
Juramos que no volverá. Nuestra voz no callará. Somos ese bravo pueblo por el cual Bolívar dio su vida por la libertad.
Por la libertad.
Y hace rato que nos afamó de las cadenas y le juramos que no volverá. Juramos que no volverá. Ey, rebeldía bolivariana, una rebelión de militantes que como estandarte llevan el barrio siempre adelante misterioso. Mi gente no quiere más engaños, son los mismos títeres que se caló el pueblo por 40 años. La lucha no parará, venceremos y vencerá todo revolucionario que por el pueblo pregone la igualdad. Nuestra moral no se cae y fieles a la patria como con Simón lo fue Manuel Sáenz.
Nuestra voz no callará el camino que está hecho en la verdad. Si no cree, pase camarada y observe pa' acá. Aún se mantiene vivo en el pueblo Bolívar. Con todos sus guerreros en el gueto entregaron su vida. Sangre latina que corre por nuestras venas. La idea ya sembrada en esta tierra hoy se cosecha. El barrio para que le duele está gritando abre brecha. Venezuela en libertad, rodilla en pie pa' la que venga.
Nuestra voz no callará.
No.
Somos ese bravo pueblo por el cual Bolívar dio su vida por la libertad.
Por la libertad.
Y hace rato que nos afamó de las cadenas y le juramos que no volverá.
No.
Juramos que no volverá. Nuestra voz no callará. Somos ese bravo pueblo por el cual Bolívar dio su vida por la libertad.
Por la libertad.
Y hace rato que nos afamó de las cadenas y le juramos que no volverá. Juramos que no volverá.
Viviremos y venceremos como que su tiempo ellos vencieron. Simón, Hugo, May Santa, y que el Che Negro primero. El pueblo está consciente de lo que son, lo que fueron. Defensores de los pobres, de la mujer y el obrero. Del chofer, de la abuelita, de la niña, del abuelo. Del chamaco de la esquina, de la cifrina de sueño. En fin, de toda esa gente de Venezuela y el guero. En fin, Latinoamérica unida en el mundo entero.
La juventud no está dormida, despertó hace mucho tiempo. Y los que mueren por la vida no pueden llamarse muertos. Por eso la consigna es la misma aunque suene fuerte. Somos fuerza, somos gente, somos patria, socialismo, muerte. Venezuela, tus llanos, tus montañas, tus senderos, tus sabanas, trincheras de todos nuestros guerreros. Tus mujeres, tus niños, la clase obrera y camaradas como yo que juran alzar tu bandera. Nuestra voz no callará.
No.
Somos ese bravo pueblo por el cual Bolívar dio su vida por la libertad.
Por la libertad.
Y hace rato que nos afamó de las cadenas y le juramos que no volverá.
No.
Juramos que no volverá. Nuestra voz no callará. Somos ese bravo pueblo por el cual Bolívar dio su vida por la libertad.
Por la libertad.
Y hace rato que nos zafamos de las cadenas y le juramos que no volverá. Juramos que no volverá.
Ey, es el proletariado. Zapato en...
Well, welcome again, everyone, to the People's Forum. We are excited to have you all with us tonight. That was an awesome music video, actually from 2013 by Gregory Palencia, Zapato MC, and Deja Vu, called No Volverán, which means they won't return. And that's a clear message to the US imperialists and all their buddies of the Venezuelan oligarchy. And in a sense, that inspires us tonight, because the Venezuelan people refuse to return to their chains, the chains that held them at the mercy of the US government and corporations for so many years, the chains that kept them hungry and cold every night. They have chosen to fight for their lives and for ours. That's why we honored them with this book titled Viviremos, which means we will live. It's the struggle to live for peace with dignity and in the march towards socialism. This book was born as the labor of love by many of us here at the People's Forum as a result of a conference we held in 2019. It's a collective effort that contributes to our process of political education and organizing in many communities and struggle to which we belong. This is a collection that comes with words from educators, intellectuals, workers, organizers, and movements around the world, and is an urgent call so that we can focus our attention on what has been this cruel form of collective punishment on the Venezuelan people. This book is also a call on the urgent need to strengthen our commitment to study what is the development of hybrid war and to integrate our fight against imperialism and sanctions into our political work. Our call is for the principal unity and integration of all our causes, that is a connection between struggles and community to defend humanity against war. Many will ask, why did we focus on Venezuela? And the answer is very simply that Venezuela continues to be at the epicenter of anti-imperialist resistance on the planet, and for us represents many of our communities in struggle. We hope with this book to actually deepen the different links of solidarity and to understand the ways in which the Venezuelan people have been fighting, have been resilient, and fill us with dignity as an offering to the collective struggles and movements of the world. In our book, we say that we are living in a period of transitions, that moment in history between what was the old world and the world that is struggling to be born. Consequently, as we work through many of those contradictions to resolve the needs of our communities, we are also forced to rethink and adjust our actions to improve the existence of our humanity. Tonight, I'm so happy to have with me two very dear friends and comrades. Claudia De la Cruz is my sister, friend, comrade, and so many other things. She is co-director with me of the People's Forum, and she's a longtime political activist and cultural worker. In fact, for many years, Claudia played a key role in connecting artists, rappers, and MCs from the US and Venezuela in a series of exchange and projects that brought about a sense of anti-imperialist culture between our two countries. Vijay Prashad, another dear friend and comrade, is the director of the Tricontinental Institute and is a prolific writer of our movements and historian in the traditions of national liberation and Marxism, or Marxism of national liberation, or national liberation Marxism, one of those three. But the interesting thing is that many times, Claudia, Vijay, and me have sat together in Caracas in conversation with many comrades to learn firsthand of the challenges posed by the brutal foreign policy of the United States. And in many of those conversations, we had another dear friend with us. His name is Carlos Ron. He is the president of the Simón Bolívar Institute in Caracas, and he has prepared a special video message for us to share a little bit more about why he also participated in the editing of this book. Carlos?
Well, thank you for this invitation once again to be here at the People's Forum. This time we're going to talk about our book, Viviremos, the hybrid war against Venezuela. And it's a really important work that we have put together, and I'm proud to be a part of the team that did this, because we're talking about a very important case of how hybrid war has been built against Venezuela. I believe we have been undergoing a hybrid war ever since 1999, when President Chavez was elected and the Bolivarian Revolution started. And the main objective, I believe, of this hybrid war could be summed down into two important things. First, as the capitalist system comes into crisis, there is a need for the system to have control of the world's most important resources. In particular, those resources that we have in oil, but also in other minerals such as gold, even water. Venezuela is a very rich country, and that can provide a lot of the resources that the capitalist system still needs to exploit and make profit from. But I think even more importantly, what we have been, why we have been a target has been because we have an alternative model, an independent foreign policy, a policy internally that promotes democratic participation, that makes the people the protagonists of the building of their own future, of their own destiny. And as Noam Chomsky says, the United States acts in international politics like the mob. It's not really, that they hit the little guy, not because they really need the money from the little guy, but because they can, show that who's the boss, and you don't have to, and you don't give the opportunity for the little guy to get away with it. They can't allow for the opportunity for someone to get away with having an independent policy from what the United States has designed, especially in our part of the world, Latin America, which they see as the backyard or their natural zone of influence. So in this regard, Venezuela has broken with the neoliberal tradition that started being implemented during the 1980s and 90s in our region. Venezuela decided to have a deeper democracy than we had before. Venezuela decided to break with the dependency of the international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. Venezuela decided that we would not follow U.S. foreign policy or align ourselves with U.S. foreign policy in multilateral spaces or in the policy in the region in the first place. And these examples, such as the examples of Cuba or other independent countries, has been, it's not acceptable for U.S. foreign policy. They need to pressure us in order to go back into the railings of their own design for the region. In this sense, it's important that to think and to see how the hybrid war is now a tool that is used against countries that defy U.S. foreign policy, that defy imperialism, that defy capitalism. It's used in a way where attacks are not only in the conventional manner with outright military attacks, but now there's other types of attacks, other sources of pressure and of pain, in order to make sure that the Venezuelan people would force change of government, and once again Venezuela would line up with U.S. foreign interests. That is particularly why I think in this hybrid war we have been attacked in the areas where this model, this independent model that Venezuela created since '99, has been even more successful. We came to a point where we defied neoliberalism and were able to switch the current and make sure that poverty was significantly reduced, and that we could tackle things such as hunger, such as the lack of health care. And those are precisely the things that are being attacked by unilateral coercive measures that limit the possibilities of the Venezuelan government and of the Venezuelan state to actually take care of its people. If you look at a report, a preliminary report that came out this year in February after Elena Duhan, the UN Special Rapporteur for the effects of unilateral coercive measures, the negative effects of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights, well, she points out how specifically areas such as healthcare, such as food, have been particularly affected in Venezuela because of these illegal unilateral coercive measures that I'm sure our colleagues would talk more about, especially about why they're illegal under international law. And I'll give you an example. Healthcare was one of the priorities of the Bolivarian Revolution. It has been ever since President Chavez and continues to be today under President Maduro. During the time where Venezuela was not subjected to this extreme pressure of unilateral coercive measures, well, we were able to advance in some important projects that took care of the Venezuelan people. And one example is the Children's Cardiology Hospital. The Children's Cardiology Hospital was able to practice a specialized operations and give a specialized care to over 1,000 children on an average, on a yearly average, since 2014. Now, in 2020, only 162 of these, of what used to be 1,000, well, now only 162 of these operations were able to take place because of the limitations that we have under the unilateral coercive measures. You may ask, well, what are these limitations? I mean, is it a lack of government interest in the hospital and functioning, or is it a problem of mismanagement? Well, it's really, you know, it comes down to problems such as the X-ray machines not being able to work because we don't have the possibility of acquiring the right spare parts to put them into function. We don't have the possibility of doing maintenance on some of these machines because the companies that used to come down to Venezuela, that have the technology, that have the patents to work in some of these machines, well, they now can't come because they are afraid that if they do, the U.S. sanctions will somehow affect them personally or affect their companies personally, and then that would limit their business or get them into even more trouble. This type of attack is not the conventional war with a military attack. It's another type of attack, and you see the strain that it causes on the Venezuelan people because now we can't provide the healthcare that we were successfully providing under the Bolivarian Revolution back, you know, ever since 99, but especially in the years between 2010 and 2014 when the hospital was put into motion. Food is another issue. And you'll often hear U.S. authorities say, well, these humanitarian aspects are covered under the licenses that are provided by the U.S. government. So it's not true that they're being affected because, you know, under the licenses you can import food and medicine. But that's not actually true. And it's not actually true because there's also this issue called overcompliance. When a lot of the companies feel that even though some things are not explicitly put down in the executive orders that implement the sanctions, well, they feel that they don't have the room to actually execute a normal transaction such as selling food or selling medicine because they feel that they're also going to be targeted and somehow be hurt. And there's examples of how that happened. There's a company in Mexico called Libre a Bordo. This company used to trade with us food in exchange for oil. And there wasn't even a monetary transaction in order to avoid some of these troubles. Well, eventually what happened? the companies, other businesses in the United States were actually cut off until they actually forced the company into bankruptcy. So this is a company that was trading oil for food. We're not talking about, you know, other types of exchanges. We're talking about food, something that's necessary for the Venezuelan people, you know, and for the population. Well, this was directly targeted in order to create this pain and this strain on the Venezuelan people. So at the end of the day, you know, what I think it's important and what we need to see in general terms is that these measures are designed specifically to cause pain, to cause suffering on the majority of the population, to make sure that this pain that is caused forces or promotes or somehow takes us to a stage where a new government is promoted, where, you know, a change of direction in Venezuela takes place, and where you know, it could once again align to U.S. foreign policy.
Thank you for that wonderful video message from Carlos. I think it actually sets the tone and shares a lot of, I think, sort of the basic information of where we even start our conversation. I will be sharing a few questions with Claudia and Vijay today, but I also hope that some of you in the audience can share some of your questions, and we'll take those at the end. I want to start with a key question for both Claudia and Vijay. I mean, in a sense, now when everyone talks about hybrid war, Venezuela has become sort of the classic example of it. What does actually, you know, what does the war against Venezuela actually look like today? I mean, Carlos mentioned elements of economic warfare, you know, preventing barter between, you know, for oil and medicine. But can you flesh out a little bit more for folks who may not know as much? What does this hybrid war look like today in Venezuela?
I don't know, Vijay, you're muted. Okay.
Whoever wants to speak first.
I mean, I could start it out. I could kick it off. I think, you know, thank you, Manolo, for agreeing to moderate this, first of all. And I think Carlos made really important points with regards to the economic piece. I think when we are trying to characterize the hybrid war against Venezuela, it's important to mention also that, you know, the diversity of tactics utilized in war has been something that could only possibly be a similarly to Cuba, which has been under war by the United States for 62 years. And obviously today we remember the victory of the Cuban Revolution against the CIA, as Vijay very well wrote it.
No, I said they kicked the ass of the CIA.
Yeah, they kicked their ass. They did. And so, you know, when we're talking about this diversity of tactics, is the economic, the political, the ideologically in post-war, like the amount of diplomatic war that takes place, also the battles that many of the representatives and the officials of Venezuela who come to the UN have to engage in to be able to get their word in, to be able to get votes in. That's part of the hybrid war as well. And I think the legalities is something that probably Vijay could speak a little bit more about, but I think it's important to mention, you know, why the hybrid wars, right? I mean, the Bolivarian Revolution with Hugo Chavez and his then chancellor, which was Nicolás Maduro, were key leaders in organizing counter-hegemonic power bloc in Latin America and Caribbean politics. And had an impact that was beyond the region. It was a global scale impact. And initiatives like ALBA, CELAC, Petrocaribe, UNASUR managed to arouse a regional consensus between governments of different ideologies that just shared this understanding of national sovereignty. And that piece is very key, because what it means
for our countries in the American region to have national sovereignty means that the United States has less dominance politically, economically, socially. And so this correlation of forces that was then reversed with US-backed coups like the one in 2009 with Honduras, with the lawfare that we experienced and saw in Brazil, with interventions of the US in electoral processes in the region, very well plotted, sophisticated process to be able to deconstruct what advances the Bolivarian Revolution had brought into the region. And I think Prabhat mentions in the book, what is happening against Venezuela now provides a lesson of what happens to a nation that dares to be free from imperialist rule of the US in the era of neoliberalism. I mean, the ruling class and its allies understand that crippling Venezuela weakens Cuba, weakens Nicaragua, weakens Bolivia, and any project that offers an alternative, even if it's not socialist, but this concept of national sovereignty is one that the United States is not interested in. And it strengthens neoliberal projects in the region like Colombia, which has been key. Like Colombia has been the love of the United States in the South American region because it's allowed so much to happen in its territory against Venezuela and against any other process of liberation. And so this war advances, extractivism, exploitation, and the theft of resources from the people, like Carlos very well mentioned. And so when we're talking about hybrid wars and all these different levels of attacks coming together, again, it's something that Venezuela has become kind of like the lab for, but it shows us what the future looks like for any other nation that decides to be free.
So Vijay, can I ask you maybe a more specific pointed question in regard to this? I mean, part of this laboratory of hybrid warfare that Claudia goes into now has devolved into a new chapter in which there are actual, armed incursions happening on the Colombian-Venezuelan border. Again, we don't see faces of US troops. We don't hear of official US participation, but what is there? I mean, how do we explain this?
Well, Claudia began by saying that today is the 60th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs defeat of the CIA on the beaches of Cuba by the Cuban Revolution. Well, in this terrific book, Viviremos, which you must all go and read, we have a little section called the Bay of Piglets. Because unlike the Bay of Pigs, which was a full-scale attempt by the CIA to go in and overthrow the government of the Communist Party in Cuba, in Venezuela, they've utilized some pretty absurd tactics, sending, 8-9 fellows. These are interesting, but we must not misunderstand what they are. And I want to say a few things about that. You see, if you're a sensible, reasonable person, and if you are swayed by evidence, you will see that the United States government is prosecuting a very cruel war against Venezuela. Today is the International Day of Solidarity with Venezuela. We are standing here with the Venezuelan people. But if you look at the evidence, you'll see that the United States, just during this pandemic, forget the prior period, stolen Venezuela's gold. This is the gold in the Bank of England. Prevented Venezuela from accessing the IMF's special credits that were provided for coronavirus relief. The United States Treasury specifically prevented Venezuela. The evidence is all over the place. It's in the public domain. The warfare is economic. This is evidence of economic warfare. Not allowing shipping companies to ship goods into Venezuela. The United States has in fact tightened rules against Cuba to now sanction shipping companies that bring goods into Cuba. Tighten those rules. The evidence of economic war is clear. Financial war is clear. The evidence of all these forms of attack are clear. But the most important warfare the most pressing warfare is the information war. Because if you lose the information war, everything else gets disguised. Then that Mr. Romero in the New York Times can lie without care. The New York Times essentially will repeat what Mike Pompeo says as if he is the great arbiter of truth. Now they will repeat Antony Blinken, another man who seems to have gone totally off the charts of what is reality. They will just print that stuff as if it's true. Mr. Maduro is a dictator. Well, they take that for granted. What's the evidence of that? What's the evidence that Evo Morales didn't win the election in October, November 2019, fair and square? The New York Times immediately came out and said he overstayed his welcome. Have they ever said that to Angela Merkel? Angela Merkel has been the Chancellor of Germany much longer than Evo Morales. They don't say it to her, she's a white woman. They say it to this indigenous president who has got the love of his people, but they don't want him there because he's for resource socialism. So they say, oh, these are dictators. They've overstayed their welcome. The information warfare is key. Look, we know it, the three of us, because we edited this book. The reason we did this book is we want to try and break that information suffocation that takes place, the lies. Look, in the book, we have a section where we talk about the March 26th press conference, where William Barr, Trump's attorney general, accused the Venezuelan government of narco trafficking. One of the most absurd press conferences I've ever seen. Because my co-authors in the chapter, when we went back and we looked at the Drug Enforcement Agency's report for the previous 10 years before 2020. In each DEA report, they indict the government of Colombia, previously Mr. Alvaro Uribe's government and now Ivan Duque. They indict the government of Colombia because they say most of the coke comes from Colombia. They say nothing about Venezuela, and yet Barr has a press conference. He says Venezuelan narco traffickers, the New York Times, CNN, they just line up. These people have no shame. They line up one after the other. They are basically marionettes. They don't have an independent perspective. They've lost their minds to the US State Department. So the information war aspect of the hybrid war, guys, that is the most crucial thing. And that's why we need you to be out there just, trying to put a little piece of reality in, especially through your movements, because we know ideas don't get seen as true unless they have power behind them. And that's one of the tragedies, is right now the truth does not have power behind it. Falsehood is powerful, and that's a real indictment of human civilization.
Well, in line with that, I definitely strongly encourage everyone to check out the link in the chat and get your copy of the book. All the proceeds actually go back to political education. But let me back to messing these two up with many more questions. I mean, when we talk again about this question of hybrid war, at this moment, the US is engaging in hybrid war with a multitude of countries. I mean, just a few days ago, Vijay reminded me that the longest wars that the US is holding right now are actually not against Afghanistan. The longest wars have been against Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and against Cuba. In a sense, we know that the US is sanctioning in one way or another 33 different countries. But what makes the sanctions, the hybrid war against Venezuela, unique or specific? I mean, why is it that they're able to, I guess, wreak so much havoc on Venezuela versus, let's say, a Russia or other countries that are being sanctioned?
This is an interesting question, and it speaks to the history of Venezuela. When Venezuela discovered oil, now about 100 years ago, the bourgeoisie in Venezuela essentially put all eggs into the oil basket. For about 40 years, two of the main political parties that ruled that country, Acción Democrática and the Christian Democrats, these parties, COPE, these parties essentially relied on oil export for everything. When Hugo Chavez wins that historic election in 1998, takes power in 1999, one of the first things he begins to talk about is the need to diversify the economy, the need for food sovereignty, the need for the sovereignty of the country and the region to be built up. And that's exactly what they went after. They wanted to prevent the use of that period for diversification and food sovereignty. It's okay to produce oil. It's okay for Nigeria to produce oil. But if Nigeria tries to become a real country, they'll suffocate you. It's okay for Jamaica to produce bauxite. If Jamaica says, no, we want to do something different than just be the exporters of a raw mineral, they come after you. And that was Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution's genuine crime. Their crime was they wanted to take Venezuela out of oil dependency. And because they were not able to do that in the very brief window that they had, Venezuela is vulnerable to attack. Venezuela continues to be vulnerable to attack because it's not completely able to rely on its own food production. As an example, it has to import food. This is not something that you can pin on the Bolivarian Revolution, which tried precisely to do the opposite. You must pin this on the way imperialism has constructed the world in such a way that in the entire tropical belt, countries are carved out into one commodity exporters. One commodity exporters is not something unique to Venezuela. You look across the tropics and you see this. It's one commodity export. In the Caribbean, you export sugarcane or you export minerals. If you're in Central America, you export bananas or something. It's a one commodity country. Guatemala, Honduras, what did they export? So that was Venezuela's vulnerability. Chavez recognized that. How many times I've heard him talk directly about the need to become food sovereign for Venezuelans to grow grains in the Amazon, in rural Venezuela, that people would eat and not import pasta. He talked so many times about why are we continuing to eat pasta? Why can't we eat our own grains? This is not something they could turn, because culture is the slowest thing to move, but it was the great vulnerability. And the imperialists have used this vulnerability effectively by choking off the country and preventing food from getting imported. This is what UN rapporteur after UN rapporteur has pointed to. These sanctions are a crime against humanity. Let me repeat that. These sanctions are a crime against humanity. Don't take my word for it. Go and read Elena Duan's preliminary findings on her study visit to Venezuela earlier this year. Go and read the special rapporteur's statements, one after the other, over the course of the last 10 years. Each one will say that from the Obama sanctions onward, the policy is essentially tantamount to a crime against humanity.
Claudia, based on your experiences, I would say traveling back and forth to Venezuela multiple times, being in conversations with communities and organizers there, what can you say of the fact that, this vulnerability in a sense has been exposed and shared, on TV screens across the world? I would talk to anyone on the street today about Venezuela and they'll probably think about mass migration, hunger, and so on. What would you have to say about that? Being an immigrant organizer yourself as well.
I think it's important to understand it within that frame. And I appreciate you bringing it, the immigrant experience. Because when we leave our countries because conditions of imperialism have created, imperialism has created conditions of poverty in our spaces, right? So the imperialist attack on Venezuela with these economic sanctions is precisely one that is meant to force the population to go against its government, right? It's meant to strangle the people so much that there is a cry coming from the bottom. And it's interestingly enough to go to Venezuela and see how unified the people are against imperialism, and understanding that the economic situation is not necessarily based even in scarcity, but in theft. The resources that Vijay was talking about, the frozen bank accounts, the stealing of the oil, like the oil companies that are here in the United States that belong to Venezuela, right? And so I wanted to bring that forth because yes, there is scarcity, and yes, there are lack of very important supplies like medical supplies, right? Based on what Carlos was talking about. But there's also a level of resistance that is coming from the people because they understand that the revolution is their revolution. It's not an imposed government. It's one that they have chosen, right? And I think, for us as immigrants, again, making that connection that we have been pushed out of our countries because there have been conditions of poverty that have been created. We can't see that separately from the attacks that Venezuela is suffering today, from the attacks, again, that Cuba has suffered throughout the years, from the misinformation that has been spread to justify these attacks. Like we know in our guts, and we know based on our experience, that imperialism is brutal. We know that imperialism has a way of strangling us based on our needs, whether it is working in a factory or working in wherever we're working, to be able to just take the very blood from us. And that's exactly what they're trying to do with the Venezuelan population. But again, the level of resistance that you see is one that you understand only comes from people that are participating in a process. People that understand that is their project to build, and they're not willing, like I've heard many times, we're not going back to being slaves of US capitalism. And I mean, those are the most beautiful words anybody can say to me at any moment.
Well, that's why the Venezuelans are my heroes. Now, obviously in this talk, we've talked in a sense about the Venezuelans as protagonists of their own history. I mean, they are making their own history every day. They're resilient, they're resisting, they're fighting back. But there's another actor in the story that obviously we can't underestimate and we can't ignore, and that is the US government. Currently, the taskmaster at hand is Mr. Biden. Interestingly, just a few, I would say maybe a month or two ago, I think in a ridiculous move, he offered temporary protective status to Venezuelan immigrants, I guess in light of this hybrid war, and at the same time told Haitian immigrants or Haitians who would be thinking of going to the United States to basically stay home. There seems to be a double-edged sword in terms of how the US approaches its foreign policy towards the region. I mean, do we expect any real changes from the Biden administration towards Venezuela? Is there any chance that the sanctions could be lifted? What would it take to get us to that point?
You see,
big questions.
Well, one of the interesting things about the politics of the United States is that there are great, great differences between the two major political parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, when it comes to their orientation towards certain domestic issues. There are great, great differences. I don't want to minimize that. When it comes to foreign policy, it's gangster team number one and gangster team number two, okay? Like on Cuba, for instance, it's gangster team number two back in the saddle. Biden's White House press secretary said that, he doesn't have any, he's not going to, Cuba is not a priority, she said. This is after gangster team number one, Donald Trump, put Cuba back on the state sponsors of terrorism list. Okay, state sponsors of terrorism. During this entire pandemic, the United States has exported 0 doctors from this country. Meanwhile, Cuba has exported hundreds of doctors to go out and heal people in COVID hot wards. What kind of terrorism are they talking about? United States bombing the whole world, exporting weapons, increased export of weaponry during the pandemic. Let's talk about terrorism. Gangster team one, gangster team two, they are the real... You want a state sponsor of terrorism? It's gangster team one and gangster team two. And none of them live in Caracas. I can tell you that. None of them live in Havana. So do we expect anything from Mr. Biden vis-a-vis Venezuela? Look, we hope at most that somebody, some liberal sitting somewhere in that US State Department is going to sign a piece of paper that lightens the sanctions because relief is necessary for people, and this kind of cruel treatment is totally unacceptable. So if there is some liberal with some sort of half-baked heart in his or her body, please sign some document to lighten some of the sanctions. But policy, they are not going to change a damn thing. They are not going to change a damn thing because the class reality in the United States, it's ugly. You need to build an independent political force of the working class in the US to shift the power dynamic of US foreign policy. Anything other than that, you're swimming in illusions. And if you want to keep swimming in illusions, that's up to you. But the people of the world cannot tolerate these bloody illusions.
So, Vijay, if I understood correctly, you said don't place your hopes in liberals and organize for revolution in the United States in order to be in solidarity with our comrades in the third world.
When the Italian communists went to see Ho Chi Minh in the 1970s, 1960s, just before he died, they said to Ho Chi Minh, how can we help you? And Ho Chi Minh's answer was the best answer in the world. He said, go home and make a revolution. Go home and make a revolution. Today is the International Day of Solidarity with Venezuela. The best solidarity that can happen is build an independent class politics in the United States that changes this wretched country around.
That's right. I mean, I think also for us in the creation of this book and putting this book together and working in collaboration with everyone who contributed to it was the understanding that there needs to be more deepening of our class consciousness and who are our class enemies and who are our brothers and sisters in struggle. And I think it's important for us to understand that as the working class, as people who are going in and out, clocking in and clocking out every day, we have way more in common with the Venezuelan people than we do with the elites of this country, than we do with Biden and his administration, because we also need to understand that these are gatekeepers of US capitalism. And like you said it very well, Vijay, in terms of imperialism is an inherent ideology and practice of US capitalism. And whoever is connected in the project of saving capitalism is not going to be anti-imperialist. And so from the very roots, from our very ground projects, from our grassroots organizing, we need to understand, again, our class. We need to understand that we are workers, that we are the poor, we are the dispossessed. And so are our comrades, friends, sisters, brothers in Venezuela who are fighting to be able to maintain the revolution they've won, that they've accomplished, you know? And so more than anything, we should look to the Venezuelan revolution, to the Cuban revolution for inspiration to be able to build the revolution in this country that is a working class revolution, because ultimately there will be nothing that changes from liberals to Democrats to Republicans if we don't make that economic based change that needs to be made in this country. And so I have no hopes in the Biden administration for doing anything more than chaos, because historically, the Democrats have been the ones that have come to save capitalism through war. That has been the history of the Democrats. And so if we are going to do anything to be able to be in solidarity again with our comrades and friends and brothers and sisters outside of this country, it needs to come through the process of building revolution in this country. And also, you know, pushing as much as we can to be able to shape the consciousness of the masses with, you know, bringing forth information, bringing forth facts, bringing forth evidence. And so we hope that the Viviremos book is part of the tools that are utilized in that development of consciousness. And I don't have my book because it was expropriated by my Chilean communist friends, but but we urge folks to get the book and engage in conversations with it. Don't just keep the conversations, you know, in your head. Share them with other folks.
Well, my last question for the two of you, seeing that we just have a few more minutes left in our hour of conversation, which has been amazing. And I feel like there's so many nice tidbits that need to be shared even after this event. But, you know, there have been multiple elections recently in Latin America. I mean, we saw the elections in Ecuador this past Sunday. There was also an election in Peru that, had interesting results for the left, with Pedro Castillo coming on top. There are possible elections, where the left has chances in Chile. There's a changing scenario in the region. Does that in any way, shape, or form impact the correlation of forces in relation to Venezuela? Is there any chance that, in the coming months, year, the Lima group can be disarticulated? Give us some hope.
Firstly, all in for Pedro Castillo in Peru. Pedro Castillo in polls released today is leading Madame Fujimori by 10 points. He is 60% of the rural vote is leaning towards him. The entire working class vote is going to him. She is winning in Lima and she is winning among the elites. So this is a person of the left. Today he spoke to Evo Morales for 3 hours. This is the consolidation. Look, frankly, it's a misnomer. It's not the Lima group. It's actually the Ottawa group. It's a group led by the Canadian government, one of the most vicious governments in the world, because more than 3/4 of world mining companies are domiciled in Canada. And basically, Justin Trudeau, for all his smiles and his coolness, is doing the work of Canadian mining companies like Barrick Gold and so on. They want to overthrow the government in Venezuela because they know there's a lot of minerals there that they want to mine. Let's just be crass about it. That's what they're up to. It's not a Lima group. But if there is a left government in Peru, if Daniel Jadwe wins in Chile, if there's a left government in 1 or 2 other countries, then there can be a new dynamic in South America. It is very important to support the candidacy of Pedro Castillo. It is extraordinarily important to support the candidacy of Daniel Jadwe in Chile. These are 2 very important elections. If the left prevails in these 2 countries, the needle in South America will shift. People like Bolsonaro may lose next year to Lula. Let's see what happens in Colombia, one of the most difficult countries for the left to win. Even though the left continues to win in Bogota and so on, it's very hard to crack that oligarchy. Very, very hard, as they found from the 1940s till now. But all in for Pedro Castillo, all in for Daniel Jadwe. Maybe liberation for the subcontinent, for the continent this time, comes from Lima and Santiago.
You almost called us a subcontinent there, but I'll let that.
Yes, I know. I'm sorry.
Claudia?
No, I mean, totally agreeing with Vijay. I think, the glimpse of hope in all this is that history teaches us that it can be done. It was done, The question, I think, and the big challenge is, how do we sustain it? How do we learn from the lessons of history to sustain that counter-hegemonic bloc that was developed, and shaped with infrastructure that's still there? How do we sustain it? And how do we, from the imperialist country of the United States of America, notice I said snakes, but anyway, how do we inside the belly of the beast support and become, part of that anti-imperialist bloc? Because we have a historical debt to do so. And so I think that we have a challenge and we have a glimpse of hope. And again, I just want to throw it out. Please get the Viviremos book. Use it as a study, self-study, collective study, but utilize it. It was meant for that.
Well, thank you, Claudia, Vijay. Thank you to Carlos Ron. Thank you to the whole team at TPF that set up this event. Thank you to the interpreter for their amazing work and making sure this event was in English and in Spanish. We're also very grateful that all of you have attended this conversation with us tonight, and we hope your interest in Venezuela was piqued. If you want to know more, there's the book, but also check out our YouTube page for other video conversations that we've already held on questions of Venezuela, including conversations with the Foreign Minister of Venezuela, Jorge Raza, and another as such. Also, if you are interested in political education, in cultural work, in organizing, in politics of liberation and hope and socialism in the future, check us out. Our website is thepeoplesforum.org. We also have a wonderful bookstore called 1804 Books that sells all your awesome revolutionary and socialist literature from India to Brazil to Argentina to New York. Check us out. You might find something interesting, and you might find that you are actually a socialist. Good night to all of you, and thank you for joining us.